They called it Black Wall Street. 35 blocks of prosperity that white America couldn't believe existed. Churches with stained glass windows that caught the Oklahoma sunlight and scattered it in colors across wooden pews. Doctors with medical degrees from the finest universities, treating patients in clinics with modern equipment. Lawyers arguing cases in mahogany-paneled offices lined with law books, their diplomas hung proudly on walls. Families living in brick homes with front porches and flower gardens. Children playing in streets where every business owner looked like them. The Greenwood district wasn't just a neighborhood. It was proof. Proof that given opportunity, Black Americans could build something extraordinary. Proof that segregation, while crushing the spirit, could also concentrate resources and create self-sufficient communities that rivaled anything white America could produce. Proof that excellence had no color. And on the corner of Greenwood and Archer, rising 3 stories high like a monument to everything Black Americans could achieve, stood the Stratford Hotel. 54 rooms of elegance, electric lights in every room, modern plumbing, a dining room that served meals on china plates, a saloon where businessmen gathered after work, a billiard hall with tables imported from back east. A man born enslaved had built the finest hotel for Black travelers in the entire country. His name was John the Baptist Stratford. At 60 years old, he had transformed himself from property into one of the wealthiest men in Oklahoma. His real estate holdings sprawled across Greenwood. His legal practice served the community's most prominent citizens. His hotel hosted performers, politicians, and professionals from across the nation. He was living proof that the American dream was possible, even for those born in chains. But on the morning of June 1st, 1921, he stood in handcuffs. Around him, everything he had built was burning. Smoke rose from 35 blocks of devastation. Bodies lay in streets. Families huddled in detention camps, held at gunpoint by men wearing badges. And the charges they would file against him weren't for defending his community. They were for daring to believe he had the right to defend it at all. This is the story of the lawyers they charged with crimes for trying to prevent a lynching. The story of men who understood the law, who believed in justice, who thought their education and their wealth might finally make them equal. They were wrong. And the price they paid would echo through generations. To understand what happened in Tulsa, you have to understand what Greenwood meant. Not just to the 10,000 Black people who lived there, but to white America watching from the other side of the railroad tracks that divided the city like a border between nations. Because Greenwood wasn't supposed to exist, not in 1921 America, not in Oklahoma, a state that had entered the Union with Jim Crow already written into its constitution. The year was 1921. Reconstruction had failed 3 decades earlier, its promises of equality abandoned as federal troops withdrew and southern states reimposed white supremacy through law and terror. Jim Crow laws spread across the South like poison, seeping into every aspect of life. Separate schools, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate everything, and nothing remotely equal about any of it. The Ku Klux Klan, reborn after the film Birth of a Nation glorified its terror in 1915, counted 3,200 members in Tulsa alone. 1 in 5 white men belonged to the Klan. They marched in parades down Main Street. They held rallies in broad daylight. Their power was no secret. Lynchings happened so regularly that newspapers barely covered them anymore unless the victims were white. Between 1890 and 1921, more than 3,000 Black Americans were murdered by mobs across the United States. Their crimes varied. looking at a white woman, talking back, succeeding in business, being accused of theft by a white person. Sometimes, no crime at all. Just being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. The law rarely intervened. Police officers often participated. Judges and juries looked the other way. Lynching was America's open secret, the violence that enforced white supremacy when laws alone couldn't contain black ambition. Black Americans were supposed to know their place, supposed to stay poor, supposed to work for white employers, rent from white landlords, buy from white merchants, supposed to accept second-class citizenship without complaint, supposed to believe the lie that they were inferior, incapable, undeserving of full humanity. Greenwood proved them wrong, spectacularly, undeniably wrong. The district had 191 businesses lining streets named after trees and founding fathers. Grocery stores where black families bought fresh produce from black farmers. Restaurants serving soul food and fine dining. Theaters showing the latest films to audiences who didn't have to sit in segregated balconies. Confectioneries selling hand-dipped chocolates. Clothing stores with the latest fashions from Chicago and New York. Barbershops and beauty parlors where community members gathered to share news and gossip. Drugstores dispensing medicine prescribed by black doctors. Funeral homes providing dignified burials when white establishments refused service. There were 2 newspapers printing stories white papers wouldn't touch. The Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun gave voice to the community's concerns, celebrated its achievements, and held white authorities accountable for their actions. A hospital where black doctors saved black lives, performing surgeries and delivering babies with skill that matched any white physician. Schools where black children learned from black teachers who saw potential in every student and refused to accept the limitations white society tried to impose. Law offices where attorneys like J.B. Stratford researched cases and filed briefs. Medical clinics where doctors like A.C. Jackson, considered one of the finest surgeons in America, treated patients with care and expertise. Dental offices, architectural firms, real estate companies, libraries filled with books, churches representing every denomination. The Williams Dreamland Theater, a massive structure that seated 750 people. The Gurley Hotel, Mann Brothers Grocery, Goodwin's One-Stop Shop, Williams Garage, Henderson's Store. Each business represented a family's dream realized, a legacy being built for future generations. Restaurants, theaters, grocery stores, law offices, everything a community needed, built by black hands with black money staying in black pockets and multiplying. This was the concept that would later be called building Black Wall Street. Every dollar spent in Greenwood circulated through the community multiple times before leaving. Every business owner hired from within the neighborhood. Every professional served their own people first. The result was wealth accumulation that defied every expectation white America held about black economic potential. And that prosperity terrified white Tulsa more than any threat of violence ever could. Because if black people could build an empire in Oklahoma, what did that say about every lie white supremacy had told? What did that say about inferiority, about natural order, about the way things were supposed to be? 2 men embodied everything white Tulsa feared. One was a newspaper publisher who dared to tell black people to arm themselves. The other was a lawyer who had gone from slavery to owning the finest hotel in the state. Both would pay the price for their success. Andrew Jackson Smitherman arrived in Tulsa in 1913 with a printing press and a mission. Born in Alabama on December 27, 1883, he had studied law at LaSalle University, He had worked his way through journalism in Muskogee before founding his own paper. The Tulsa Star became his weapon against injustice. Smitherman didn't write the kind of careful, measured editorials that white newspapers expected from black publishers. He wrote fire. When a white mob lynched Roy Belton in 1920, dragging him from the courthouse jail and hanging him in full view of Tulsa police, Smitherman printed words that made white readers furious. "The lynching," he wrote, "explodes the theory that a prisoner is safe on the top of the courthouse from mob violence." He meant it as a warning to his community. If white authorities wouldn't protect a white prisoner, they certainly wouldn't protect a black one. Better to be ready. Better to be armed. Better to stand together than to die alone hoping the law might save you. Across town, John the Baptist Stratford had built his empire on a different kind of resistance. Born into slavery in 1861 in Kentucky, he had watched his father purchase freedom for their family. Stratford took that gift and multiplied it. He graduated from Oberlin College at a time when few white students attended, let alone black ones. He earned his law degree from Indianapolis College of Law, admitted to practice in 1900. But Stratford didn't just practice law. He understood that real power came from ownership. When he arrived in Tulsa, he bought land. Lots of it. He subdivided parcels and sold them exclusively to other black families, building the foundations of Greenwood block by block. Then he constructed his masterpiece. The Stratford Hotel opened as a statement. 3 stories of red brick. More than 50 rooms with modern plumbing and electric lights. A dining room, a saloon, a billiard hall. Black travelers from across the country made reservations months in advance. It wasn't just accommodation. It was proof. Proof that a man born as property could own property. Proof that black excellence could rival anything white America built. Both men knew the danger they represented. Smitherman published Democratic Politics in a community that traditionally voted Republican, challenging even his own readers to think independently. Stratford sued the railroad for forcing him into segregated cars, fighting Jim Crow in court even when he knew he'd lose. They pushed boundaries because they believed their success had bought them something precious. Not safety, perhaps, but the right to defend themselves. That belief would be tested on Memorial Day, 1921. Dick Rowland was 19 years old. He shined shoes at a parlor on Main Street in downtown Tulsa. Like many young black workers, he had no access to bathrooms in the whites-only businesses where he worked. His employer had arranged for him to use the colored restroom on the top floor of the nearby Drexel building. To get there, he had to ride the elevator. On May 30th, 1921, Rowland stepped into that elevator. The operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened next remains uncertain even a century later. The elevator in the Drexel building was old, unreliable. It often stopped unevenly with the floors. Most historians believe Rowland tripped as he entered. Trying to catch himself, he grabbed the first thing he could reach. Sarah Page's arm. She screamed, not because she was assaulted, not because Rowland had attacked her. She screamed because she was startled, but a white clerk heard that scream and saw a black teenager running from the elevator. In 1921 Tulsa, that was all the evidence anyone needed. By the next morning, Dick Rowland was in jail. By that afternoon, the Tulsa Tribune had published a story that transformed an accidental stumble into an attempted attack. The headline screamed across the front page. Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator. The article claimed Rowland had stalked Page, that he had torn her clothes, that he called himself Diamond Dick and presented himself to police with arrogance. None of it was true. Police Chief John Gustafson would later testify that Page bore no scratches, bruises, or disarranged dress, that she stated the boy made no bad remark of any kind. But by the time the truth could be told, Tulsa was already burning. That evening, a white mob began gathering outside the courthouse where Rowland was held. First dozens, then hundreds. By 7:30, white men filled the streets carrying ropes and guns. They chanted for the sheriff to hand over the prisoner. They wanted a lynching. Sheriff Willard McCullough barricaded the top floor and refused. He had seen what happened to Roy Belton. He wouldn't let it happen again. In Greenwood, word spread fast. A young black man, false accusations, a white mob. Everyone knew how this story ended. It ended with a body swinging from a tree. It ended with the law looking the other way. It ended with black families mourning while white newspapers justified murder as justice. But that evening, something different happened. That evening, Black Tulsa said no. At the offices of the Tulsa Star, community leaders gathered. Smitherman was there. Stradford arrived. They debated what to do. Some counseled patience. Sheriff McCullough had promised to protect Rowland. Maybe the law would hold this time. Maybe things were different now. Others disagreed. They had read Smitherman's editorials about Roy Belton. They knew that waiting for white authorities to do the right thing usually meant waiting while another black body was cut down from a rope. These men were World War I veterans. They had fought for democracy in France. They owned businesses. They paid taxes. They had rights, didn't they? Around 9:30 that night, between 25 and 30 black men armed themselves and drove to the courthouse. Not to start trouble, to prevent it. They offered to help the sheriff protect his prisoner. McCullough told them he had the situation under control. Reluctantly, they left. But the white mob kept growing. By 10 o'clock, more than 2,000 white men surrounded the courthouse. Rumors flew that the black men were coming back, that they were arming for war, that Greenwood was preparing to attack white Tulsa. So 75 black men returned to the courthouse. Veterans who had carried rifles through European battlefields, business owners who believed their success had earned them respect, men who thought that showing strength might prevent bloodshed rather than cause it. They were terribly, tragically wrong. In the chaos of that hot Oklahoma night, someone fired a shot. Witnesses disagreed about who. Some said an elderly white man tried to disarm a black veteran, and the gun went off in the struggle. Others claimed a black man fired first. The truth died in the violence that followed. Within minutes, gunfire erupted across downtown Tulsa. Black men and white men shot at each other in the streets. By midnight, 12 people lay dead, 10 white, 2 black. The shooting didn't stop the mob. It enraged them. Throughout that night, white Tulsa prepared for war. Men raided hardware stores and sporting goods shops, arming themselves with rifles and ammunition. Police officers didn't stop them. Instead, the police commissioner and inspector began deputizing white men by the hundreds. More than 500 were given badges in less than 30 minutes. Many had been drinking. Many had been part of the mob calling for Rowland's lynching just hours before. Now they had official authority. Now they had the law on their side. And with the sunrise, they would have their vengeance. At dawn on June 1st, 1921, the invasion began. Armed white men, many wearing their new deputy badges, moved toward Greenwood in organized formations. This wasn't a riot. It was a military assault. Veterans who had learned tactical warfare in France now turned those skills on American citizens. They advanced block by block, house by house, building by building. What happened next was systematic destruction on a scale America hadn't seen since the Civil War. White invaders broke into homes and businesses not randomly but methodically, moving block by block in military formation. They looted money from cash registers and safes. They stole jewelry from dressers and drawers. They took furs, musical instruments, furniture, anything of value that could be carried away. Witnesses reported seeing white women driving through Greenwood in cars piled high with stolen goods, laughing as they passed. Then they set fires. Not random fires born of mob chaos. Coordinated arson executed with military precision. They used torches soaked in oil. They poured gasoline on wooden structures. They ignited anything that would burn. Some witnesses reported seeing airplanes overhead, small private planes banking low over Greenwood and dropping what looked like firebombs or turpentine balls onto rooftops. Whether those planes belonged to the governor's office, to Sinclair Oil Company, or to private citizens with pilot licenses, no one could later prove definitively. The official investigations avoided the question, but survivors knew what they saw. Greenwood burned from above and below, trapped in a circle of fire that destroyed everything in its path. Churches where families had worshipped for decades became infernos. The stained glass windows that had taken years to save for and install melted in temperatures hot enough to warp steel. Bells that had called the faithful to prayer for 20 years fell silent as flames consumed the towers that held them. Hymnals turned to ash. Pews that had supported the weight of generations crumbled to charcoal. Schools where children had learned to read and write and dream became rubble. Chalkboards shattered in the heat. Desks handcrafted by local carpenters were reduced to kindling. Books donated by families who could barely afford them burned page by page, knowledge turning to smoke. The library that had taken the community 15 years to build, stocking shelves with volumes purchased one at a time, gone in an hour. Black residents tried to flee. Some ran toward downtown, hands raised, begging for mercy. They were rounded up at gunpoint, detained, marched to makeshift internment camps at the fairgrounds and convention hall. 6,000 people held like prisoners of war, in their own city, on American soil. Others tried to fight back. From the second-floor porch of the Stratford Hotel, men fired at the advancing mob, trying desperately to protect what they had built. It was useless. The white attackers had machine guns, they had superior numbers, they had the backing of local police. J.B. Stratford watched his hotel take fire, watched flames consume the finest rooms, the elegant dining hall, the billiard tables and mahogany furniture he had chosen with such care. Everything he had built, everything his empire represented, reduced to ashes while deputized white men cheered. Dr. Andrew Jackson, one of the finest surgeons in Oklahoma, black or white, surrendered peacefully. He walked out with his hands up, telling them his name. Witnesses heard one of the deputized men say, "Oh shit, those boys have done it now." Then they shot him anyway. A respected doctor, a healer, murdered in cold blood by men wearing badges. By noon on June 1st, Greenwood was gone. 35 city blocks destroyed. 1,256 homes burned. 191 businesses reduced to rubble. Churches with their bells still ringing until flames melted them silent. Schools where children had learned their ABCs. The hospital where black doctors had delivered black babies. All of it. Gone. Official records would later claim 36 people died. Contemporary witnesses knew better. Bodies were loaded onto trucks and dumped in mass graves. The Arkansas River ran red. Credible estimates put the death toll between 150 and 300 people, most of them black. most of them killed by white men wearing badges and carrying deputization papers from the city of Tulsa. 10,000 people were left homeless. More than $200 million in property destroyed, if you calculate it in today's currency. But the real theft wasn't just property. It was generational wealth. It was businesses that would never reopen. Children who would never inherit their parents' prosperity. Dreams that burned as surely as the buildings that held them. And when the smoke finally cleared, when martial law was declared and National Guard troops arrived too late to save anyone, the city of Tulsa looked at the devastation and asked one question: who should be punished for this? On June 15, 1921, an all-white grand jury issued its indictments. They charged John the Baptist Stratford. They charged Andrew Jackson Smitherman. They charged more than 80 black men with inciting a riot. Not the white mob that had burned 35 blocks. Not the deputized vigilantes who had murdered doctors and children. Not the police who had armed and organized the invasion. The black men who had tried to prevent a lynching. Those were the criminals. The charges carried brutal penalties: life in prison or death. For trying to save an innocent teenager from being hanged by a mob. For believing they had the right to defend their community. For daring to stand up when white supremacy told them to kneel. Stratford was arrested and held in a detention center. His son, C.F. Stratford, a lawyer practicing in Chicago, drove through the night to Tulsa. He filed a writ of habeas corpus, demanding his father's release. The legal maneuver worked, but just barely. J.B. Stratford walked out of that detention center knowing he couldn't stay in Oklahoma. The authorities wanted his blood. The grand jury had blamed him personally for the massacre. Newspapers called him an instigator, a troublemaker, a dangerous radical. This man who had studied constitutional law under former President Benjamin Harrison. This man who had built his wealth through careful investment and legal practice. They called him a criminal. So he ran. He sold his land for $1. One single dollar for property worth tens of thousands. He left behind an empire worth more than $2 million in today's money. He boarded a train bound for Independence, Kansas. As the train pulled slowly past Greenwood Avenue, Stratford looked down at the remnants of his community, his hotel, his dream, his proof that a man born enslaved could build an empire. All of it was now a smoldering pile of bricks. Smitherman fled too. He had been warned that staying in Tulsa meant certain conviction, maybe execution. He gathered his wife Ollie and their 5 children. They traveled first to Massachusetts, living in hiding while Oklahoma tried to extradite him. The state wanted him to face trial, wanted him to serve as an example. But Smitherman had studied law. He knew the charges were baseless. He also knew that in 1921, Oklahoma, a black man accused of inciting a riot against white authority would never get a fair trial. The jury would be all white. The judge would be white, the prosecutor would be white, and the victims of the massacre, the black residents who had lost everything, would have no voice at all. So Andrew Jackson Smitherman stayed in exile. He moved his family to Buffalo, New York in 1925. There, far from Oklahoma, he started over. He worked odd jobs, he lectured, he wrote. By 1932, he had saved enough money to found another newspaper, the Buffalo Star, later renamed the Empire Star. In Buffalo, Smitherman became a respected voice in the black community once again. He exposed corruption. He challenged officials. He demanded equal treatment. The courage that had gotten him charged in Tulsa served him well in New York. But he never forgot what had been taken from him. His newspaper, his home, his city. He never returned to Tulsa. not once in the 40 years he lived after the massacre. The indictment hung over him like a shadow. Even in Buffalo, even building a new life, he was technically a fugitive from Oklahoma justice. Stradford settled in Chicago. His son helped him establish a legal practice. J.B. Stradford became a successful attorney, serving clients in one of America's largest cities. His descendants would go on to become lawyers, judges, diplomats. His great-grandson, John Rogers, Jr., would found Ariel Investments, one of the largest African-American-owned investment firms in the nation. But J.B. Stradford never stopped mourning what he had lost. His unpublished memoir, written years later, captured the depth of his pain. It is incredible to believe that in this civilized age that a white man could be so void of humanity, he wrote. My soul cried for revenge and prayed for the day to come, when I could personally avenge the wrongs which had been perpetrated against me. He died in Chicago in 1935 at the age of 74. He died wanted by the state of Oklahoma. He died with charges of inciting a riot still listed next to his name. He died knowing that the men who had burned his hotel, who had murdered his neighbors, who had destroyed 35 blocks of black prosperity, had never faced a single day in prison. Back in Tulsa, a different kind of legal battle was just beginning. Buck Colbert Franklin had arrived in Greenwood in early 1921, just months before the massacre transformed his new home into a war zone. Born on May 6, 1879, near Homer in what would become Oklahoma, Franklin represented everything the state could be if it lived up to its promises. His father had escaped slavery and fought for the Union Army, carrying a rifle for the freedom he'd been denied his entire life. His mother was one-quarter Choctaw, connecting him to the land's indigenous history. Buck himself had studied law by correspondence while teaching school in the tiny towns that dotted the Oklahoma Territory, reading case law by lamplight after his students went home. He was finally admitted to the Oklahoma bar in December 1907, becoming one of the state's first black attorneys. He had come to Tulsa seeking opportunity in a community that valued education and professionalism. What he found instead was catastrophe beyond anything he could have imagined. When the white mob invaded Greenwood on June 1st, Franklin was rounded up with thousands of other black residents. Men in uniform, some wearing police badges and others wearing the armbands of hastily deputized vigilantes, herded him and his neighbors at gunpoint toward downtown. They were detained in Convention Hall, the same building that had hosted concerts and political rallies and boxing matches. Now it served as an internment camp, holding thousands of people whose only crime was living in the wrong part of town. Franklin was held for days, treated like an enemy of the state rather than a practicing attorney and respected member of the Oklahoma bar. He watched guards march elderly people past at gunpoint. He heard children crying for parents who had been separated during the chaos. He saw sick people denied medical care. He witnessed American citizens imprisoned without charges, without due process, without any of the rights the Constitution supposedly guaranteed. But Franklin survived. And when he was finally released, when the authorities decided he wasn't a threat and gave him a green card identifying him as one of the good Negroes who could move freely, he didn't run like Smitherman and Stradford. He didn't flee to Kansas or Massachusetts or anywhere else that might offer safety. He stayed. While the city was still smoking, while the authorities were still arresting black residents on fabricated charges, while white Tulsans were loading stolen goods into trucks, Buck Colbert Franklin set up a law office. Not in a building. There were no buildings left standing in Greenwood. The few structures that hadn't burned completely were damaged beyond use. Their walls cracked and roofs collapsed. So Franklin practiced law from a tent. A Red Cross tent pitched in the middle of the ruins, surrounded by the ashes of what had been the most prosperous black community in America. With a typewriter salvaged from the debris, its keys still working despite exposure to smoke and heat. With a telephone line the Red Cross had managed to install, giving him connection to the outside world. With law books he had carried out when he fled his burning office, their pages singed at the edges, but their words still legible. His partner, I.H. Spears, worked alongside him, sharing the cramped space and the overwhelming workload. A temporary secretary, Effie Thompson, helped them file paperwork with courts that barely wanted to acknowledge black attorneys existed, much less that they had legitimate cases to pursue. And outside that tent, under the Oklahoma sun that beat down mercilessly on canvas that offered little protection, a line formed. Not just dozens of people, hundreds, thousands eventually. All of them with the same question, the same desperate need. How do we rebuild? How do we reclaim our land? How do we fight a city that wants us gone? How do we survive this? The city of Tulsa had an answer to that question. You don't. 6 days after the massacre, while families were still searching for missing loved ones and bodies were still being pulled from the Arkansas River, the city commission passed a new fire ordinance. The law required all new construction in the Greenwood area to be built from fireproof materials. Brick that cost 3 times what wood cost. Steel that required specialized installation. Concrete that needed to be poured and cured properly. Materials that the average family who had just lost everything couldn't possibly afford. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. The city claimed they were protecting residents, ensuring safety, improving standards. But everyone knew the real purpose. Black families who had lost everything in the massacre couldn't afford to rebuild with expensive materials. They had no insurance payments coming because companies cited riot exclusions in their policies. They had no savings left because everything had burned. They had no income because their businesses were destroyed and their employers' businesses were destroyed. They were broke, homeless, and traumatized. And now the city was telling them they had to spend thousands they didn't have to rebuild on land they owned. The ordinance would force them to sell their land cheap to white developers. The massacre had destroyed their homes. The law would steal their land. Buck Franklin filed suit. Joe Lockard versus T.D. Evans. He took on the mayor, the city commission, and the entire apparatus of Tulsa government. His argument was simple but profound. The city did not have the right to prohibit black property owners from rebuilding on their own land. The fire ordinance violated their property rights without due process. It was a brilliant piece of legal reasoning. And Franklin knew it was Black Tulsa's last hope. Lose this case, and Greenwood would become white-owned commercial property. Black Wall Street would be erased not just physically, but legally. The city appealed. They threw every resource at shutting down Franklin's challenge. But in September 1921, a 3-judge panel of Tulsa County judges ruled in Franklin's favor. The fire ordinance was struck down. Black residents could rebuild on their own land using whatever materials they could afford. It was a victory, a crucial, necessary victory. But it couldn't repair what had been lost. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot exclusions in their policies. Banks wouldn't extend credit. The Red Cross provided some relief, but the scope of need was overwhelming. Families spent the winter of 1921 through 22 living in tents while they tried to rebuild homes from ashes. Franklin worked from his tent office for months, filing insurance claims that would mostly be denied, helping families navigate property disputes, fighting for compensation that would never come. He couldn't get justice. The legal system was designed to protect white interests, not deliver fairness to black victims. But he could give people a fighting chance. His work that year would define his career. Buck Colbert Franklin went on to become an expert in oil law, representing black and Native American clients against white lawyers working for oil barons. His son, John Hope Franklin, would become one of the most respected historians in American history, documenting the very events his father survived. Meanwhile, Dick Rowland, the young man whose arrest had sparked it all, simply disappeared. The charges against him were quietly dropped in September 1921. Sarah Page declined to prosecute. She stated she did not wish to press charges. The whole case had been built on a lie, on a stumble in an elevator transformed into an assault by white newspapers and white rage. Rowland reportedly left Tulsa immediately. Some accounts place him in Kansas City. Others claim he died in a wharf explosion in Oregon decades later. His real fate remains unknown. The teenager at the center of one of America's worst massacres became a ghost, his story lost to history. Sarah Page vanished too. Within months of the massacre, she left Tulsa. She married a man named Fred Voorhees and moved away. She never spoke publicly about Dick Rowland or the massacre, never offered her account of what really happened in that elevator, never acknowledged the role her scream played in igniting 18 hours of terror. The white perpetrators? Not one was convicted, despite overwhelming evidence, despite photographs of the burning, despite testimonies from survivors, despite the mass graves and the destroyed blocks and the thousands of homeless people. The all-white grand jury blamed black Tulsans for the lawlessness. They said the presence of armed Negroes was the direct cause of the riot. They pointed to agitation among the Negroes for social equality as the real problem. The police chief who had deputized hundreds of white men and given them weapons to attack Greenwood. He was found guilty of negligence and fired. That was it. No prison time. No criminal charges for organizing a massacre. Just the loss of his job. Tulsa wanted to forget. For decades, the massacre disappeared from history books, from classrooms, from public memory. Parents who had lived through it refused to tell their children what happened. Schools didn't teach it. The Tulsa Tribune's feature called 15 Years Ago Today never mentioned it. Neither did 25 years ago today. A 2017 report on the history of the Tulsa Fire Department, spanning from 1897 to publication, made no mention of 1921. The silence was intentional. Tulsa was booming in the 1920s. Oil money flooded in. The city wanted to attract investment, not scare it away with stories of race massacres. So they buried the truth. They let Greenwood's story fade. But the charges against Smitherman and Stradford remained. Decades passed. Both men died in exile, their names officially linked to criminal indictments. Their families carried that shame. Their descendants grew up knowing their grandfathers had been forced to flee, branded as criminals for trying to protect their community. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, something finally changed. Cornelius E. Toole, Stradford's great-grandson and a circuit court judge in Chicago, had spent his life researching his family's history. He reached out to Oklahoma State Representative Don Ross, who represented the district where Greenwood had stood. Ross contacted Tulsa County District Attorney Bill LaFortune and asked him to re-examine the case. LaFortune studied the records. He reviewed the commission reports. He looked at the evidence with eyes unclouded by the racism of 1921. His conclusion was simple. The charges against J.B. Stradford were baseless. The grand jury that had indicted him had been charged emotionally and politically. The rule of law had broken down during the massacre, and justice required finally setting things right. On October 11, 1996, in a ceremony at the Greenwood Cultural Center, Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating presented the Stradford family with an honorary executive pardon. District Attorney LaFortune requested that the court formally drop all charges. After 75 years, J.B. Stradford was officially exonerated. No longer a wanted fugitive, no longer a criminal. "It is regrettable," Governor Keating said, "that we have to come together to recognize an embarrassment, a historic event that never should have happened." But J.B. Stradford never knew. He had been dead for 61 years. 11 years later, in 2007, the charges against Andrew Jackson Smitherman were finally dismissed. Barbara Seals Nevergold, a historian at the University at Buffalo, had discovered Smitherman's connection to Buffalo while researching African American history in Oklahoma. She learned about the indictment, she learned about his life in exile, and she launched a campaign to clear his name. For nearly a year, Nevergold called and wrote to the Tulsa County District Attorney's office. She gathered testimonials from people who had known Smitherman in Buffalo. She made the case that this was a man of integrity, honesty, and high morals. A man who had been wrongly accused. A man who deserved justice even if it came decades after his passing. Tulsa County District Attorney Tim Harris studied the records and report released by the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. He reached the same conclusion LaFortune had 11 years earlier. The rule of law which governs our search for the truth in our criminal justice system broke down during this tragic event, Harris said. Justice would best be served if charges were dismissed against not only Mr. Smitherman, but all defendants. On December 11, 2007, in a ceremonial court hearing at the Greenwood Cultural Center, Harris filed a motion to dismiss the charges against Smitherman and all 55 other defendants indicted by the grand jury in 1921. None of them were believed to still be alive, but their names were finally cleared. Smitherman had been dead for 46 years. The exonerations came too late for the men who had been charged, too late for the families who had lived under the shadow of those accusations, too late for the thousands who had been detained, beaten, traumatized, and displaced. But they mattered anyway, because they were an acknowledgement, a recognition that what happened in Tulsa wasn't a riot caused by black agitation. It was a massacre, a coordinated, systematic attack on black prosperity by white supremacists wearing badges and carrying government-issued weapons. Today, the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is finally being told. Students learn about it in Oklahoma schools. Museums document the destruction. Historians continue searching for mass graves, trying to give names to the dead who were buried without ceremony or record. Survivors have testified before Congress. Viola Fletcher, 107 years old in 2021, told lawmakers about what she witnessed as a 7-year-old child. The sound of gunfire, the smell of burning, the terror of running while white men shot at her family. "I'm here seeking justice," she said, "and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The Black Wall Street that Smitherman and Stradford tried to protect never fully recovered. Greenwood did rebuild. Families returned. Businesses reopened. By the 1940s and 50s, the district thrived again, though never reaching the prosperity it had known before the massacre. Then urban renewal and highway construction in the 1960s and 70s fragmented what remained, dispersing the community and destroying much of what survivors had rebuilt. But the legacy endures. The lawyers who were charged for defending their community left descendants who continue their fight. The businesses they built inspired generations of Black entrepreneurs. The resistance they showed, the courage to stand armed at a courthouse and say, "No, this lynching will not happen," that spirit lives on. At the University of Tulsa College of Law, the Buck Colbert Franklin Legal Clinic provides free legal services to residents of the Greenwood neighborhood. Every year, the school hosts the Buck Colbert Franklin Memorial Civil Rights Lecture. The clinic operates in the same spirit Franklin embodied when he set up that tent in the ruins. Service, leadership, justice. The story of Black Wall Street is ultimately about what happens when Black people succeed. When they build wealth, when they create institutions, when they demonstrate excellence that challenges every myth of white superiority. It reveals the violence that system is willing to deploy to maintain itself. Smitherman and Stradford weren't charged because they were criminals. They were charged because they were successful, because they were educated, because they owned property and published newspapers and built hotels and dared to believe that their prosperity had earned them rights. Because when white Tulsa came for one of their own, they stood up and said no. That's what made them dangerous. Not violence, not crime, success. Black success in a nation built on the idea that Black people were meant to fail. The massacre destroyed 35 blocks, but it couldn't destroy the idea that those blocks represented. It couldn't erase the memory of what Greenwood had been. It couldn't stop the descendants of survivors from telling the truth, and it couldn't prevent history from finally, belatedly, acknowledging that the real criminals weren't the men who tried to prevent a lynching. They were the men who burned a city rather than accept Black equality. Andrew Jackson Smitherman and John the Baptist Stradford died in exile. They died branded as criminals by the state that should have protected them. They died without ever receiving compensation for what was stolen, without seeing anyone punished for the massacre, without returning to the city they had helped build. But they died knowing they had stood for something. They had defended their community when it mattered most. They had used the law as a shield even when the law was being used as a weapon against them. They had shown their children and grandchildren that resistance was possible. That dignity was worth preserving even at tremendous cost. Their exonerations, though they came far too late, matter. They matter because they tell the truth about who the real criminals were. They matter because they acknowledge that the charges were always lies. They matter because they give us language to describe what happened. Not a riot, a massacre. Not agitators, defenders, not criminals, victims. The lawyers they charged for defending Black Wall Street became lawyers who rebuilt in exile, who published newspapers and practiced law and raised families and proved that you can destroy a community, but you cannot destroy a people. Their story is part of the American story, the part we tried to bury, the part that keeps resurfacing because truth has a way of refusing to stay silent. On the hilltop where the Stradford Hotel once stood, a historical marker now tells visitors what happened. Where Smitherman's newspaper office printed truth to power, a museum preserves the memory. The streets where 10,000 people